The soup course had just been cleared when the disturbance began in earnest. It started with a scream, not the theatrical shriek of a woman startled by a mouse, but something far more primal, a sound that seemed to originate from the very depths of human terror. It came from somewhere above, perhaps the second floor, muffled only slightly by the manor's thick walls and ornate plasterwork. The dining room fell silent, as abruptly as if someone had severed all sound at its source. Eleanor Ashford's fork clattered against her plate. For just a moment, the briefest flicker of an instant, her carefully maintained composure fractured. Miss Marple, who missed nothing, observed the exact sequence, the widening of the eyes, the slight parting of the lips, and then the swift reassertion of control. Eleanor set down her napkin with deliberate precision. "I'm certain it's nothing," Eleanor announced to the table at large, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "Perhaps one of the servants has had a small accident. These old houses do have their peculiarities. Please, do continue with your dinner." But the magic of the evening had been irrevocably broken. Guests exchanged nervous glances. The military historian beside Miss Marple leaned toward her and whispered something about the staff these days, but his words seemed to come from a great distance. The conversation resumed, but it had a forced, artificial quality, like dialogue delivered by actors who had forgotten their lines. Catherine had gone quite pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her water glass to her lips. James was no longer attending to Vivienne, who had turned to engage the guest on her other side with rather aggressive cheerfulness. Dr. Blackwood had set down his cutlery and was watching Eleanor with an expression of barely concealed concern. 5 minutes later, one of the manor's senior staff members, a man named Stevens, whom Miss Marple recognized from previous village events, appeared at Eleanor's elbow and bent to whisper something in her ear. Whatever he said had the effect of draining the remaining color from Eleanor's face. She excused herself from the table with admirable composure, murmuring something about checking on a guest who was unwell. She did not return. The dinner continued in a state of subdued chaos. The serving staff appeared increasingly flustered, moving with less precision than before. Guests whispered to one another, their curiosity now openly evident. The lovely consommé went largely untouched. By the time the main course was served, an elaborate beef Wellington that under normal circumstances would have been the crown jewel of the evening, most of the guests had abandoned even the pretense of appetite. James excused himself, claiming he needed to make a telephone call. 10 minutes later, Catherine rose abruptly and left the room without explanation. Vivienne remained, but she had ceased her forced brightness and now sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. It was Dr. Blackwood who finally stood, and with a quiet word to the host at the table's head, made his way toward the door. His medical instincts, Miss Marple supposed, had overcome the demands of courtesy. When the local police arrived, summoned as it eventually transpired by Eleanor herself, they came with the quiet urgency of men responding to something far more serious than a minor household accident. 2 constables, followed by Inspector Lawrence Davies, a capable man of perhaps 50 whom Miss Marple had encountered during one of her previous village mysteries. The inspector's appearance at the dining-room door, his eyes sweeping across the assembled guests, communicated what Eleanor's carefully. Worded announcement could not. Something dreadful had occurred within the walls of Thornfield Manor. It was Davies who, with the kind of gentle authority that made him respected even by those who feared him, invited all guests to remain in the drawing-room while initial inquiries were made. Nobody was to leave the premises. The French doors were closed, cutting off the scent of wisteria and the comfort of the cooling night air. As the guests filed into the adjoining room, a confusion of whispered speculation following them like smoke, Miss Marple remained seated at the table for a moment longer. She studied the abandoned plates, the half-empty glasses, the abandoned napkins. She noted that Vivienne's hands, as she stood to leave, were perfectly steady, not the hands of someone in shock, but rather the hands of someone exercising considerable self-control. She also noticed that on the table beside where James had been sitting, there remained a small object that he appeared to have forgotten, a key, made of brass, with an ornate head worked in the shape of a peacock. It was the sort of key one might use to access a locked room, or a locked drawer, or a locked cabinet. Miss Marple rose from her seat with the careful deliberation of advanced age and, gathering her handbag, made her way toward the drawing-room. Her face betrayed nothing of what she was thinking. Her mind, however, was already constructing the first delicate threads of a hypothesis, weaving together the quarrel she had heard during dinner, the scream that had followed, the nervous reactions of the guests, and this small brass key with its proud peacock head. The evening had taken a most unexpected turn indeed. The drawing-room at Thornfield Manor was a study in controlled panic. Nearly 100 guests, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of summer entertaining, found themselves trapped in an elegant prezzo, of their own making. The crystal chandeliers cast a merciless light on faces that ranged from merely curious to genuinely frightened. Servants circulated with champagne that nobody wanted, their practiced professionalism barely masking the tension that had infected the entire household. Miss Marple settled herself in a corner armchair, her knitting retrieved from her handbag with the efficiency of long practice. The needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the anxious murmuring that filled the room. To any observer, she appeared to be an elderly woman absorbed in her handicraft, precisely the sort of detail that people looked through rather than at. It was one of her greatest advantages. Inspector Davies had taken command of the situation with admirable swiftness. He had stationed one constable at the drawing-room door, and another near the main entrance, effectively cordoning off the guests from the rest of the manor. Whatever had occurred upstairs remained, for the moment, a mystery accessible only to the inspector and the senior household staff. It was Eleanor who finally appeared, some 40 minutes after the initial crisis. She descended the main staircase slowly, one hand trailing along the banister, looking as though she had aged a decade in the intervening time. Her elaborate coiffure had come slightly undone, a strand of white hair escaping its pins and curling against her temple. She went directly to Inspector Davies, who had been waiting in the entrance hall, and spoke to him in low, urgent tones. The inspector's expression did not change, but Miss Marple observed the minute stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed fractionally. He nodded, made a brief note in the small leather book he carried, and then turned to address the assembled guests. "I'm afraid I must inform you," Davies began, his voice carrying the particular gravity that police officers reserve for the delivery of bad news, that there has been a fatality at Thornfield Manor. A guest has died under circumstances that require investigation. I must ask you all to remain here while we conduct our preliminary inquiries." The response was immediate and chaotic. Gasps, exclamations of shock, a woman's sharp cry of distress. The military historian beside Miss Marple stood abruptly, his face flushing with indignation. Others clustered together, forming small groups defined by existing social alliances and the comfort of familiar faces. Only a few remained notably composed. Catherine Ashford stood rigidly near the window, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. James Verton had moved to stand near the fireplace, his handsome face carefully arranged into an expression of shock, though his eyes betrayed calculation rather than genuine surprise. Vivian sat on one of the velvet settees, apparently unconcerned, turning the pages of a magazine with mechanical precision. "Who?" Eleanor's voice cut through the confusion. "Inspector, who has died?" Davies hesitated, glancing toward Eleanor as though seeking confirmation of something they had already discussed. When she nodded slightly, he continued, "It appears to be Mr. Adrian Harrington. He was found in the library approximately half an hour ago." The name meant nothing to Miss Marple at first, and she observed the reactions of others with great interest. Some guests looked puzzled. Clearly they did not know who Adrian Harrington was, or had not realized he was among the gathering. But others reacted with what appeared to be genuine recognition tinged with shock. James made a small sound, something between a cough and a gasp, and turned his face away. Catherine's eyes widened, and she gripped the windowsill as though she might otherwise collapse. Eleanor remained motionless. Expression carved from stone. It was Dr. Blackwood who asked the obvious question, "How did he die, Inspector?" Davies consulted his notebook, his manner suggesting he was reading from official notes rather than making an off-the-cuff observation. "The preliminary indication is poisoning. There was an empty glass beside him and a strong smell of bitter almonds in the vicinity. We'll, of course, await the post-mortem examination for confirmation." Cyanide, Miss Marple thought automatically. The bitter almond smell was virtually diagnostic. Someone at Thornfield Manor had possessed not only the motive to kill Adrian Harrington, but also the knowledge of poisons and the access to them. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not a crime of impulse, but rather one of premeditation. The gathering descended further into chaos, but Miss Marple continued her knitting, her needles moving with steady rhythm. She was thinking about that brass key with the peacock head, still resting on the dining room table where James had left it. She was thinking about the quarrel she had heard before dinner, about Eleanor's sudden pallor, about Catherine's trembling hands. Most of all, she was thinking about Adrian Harrington, a man whose death had clearly been expected by someone at this gathering. Expected not in the sense of anticipation, but in the sense that it solved some problem that had been weighing heavily on their mind. In Miss Marple's long experience, people who solved their problems through murder typically wore a very particular expression when those problems were finally resolved. She had observed that expression on someone's face tonight, though not yet on the face of the person she most suspected. The evening had taken its darkest turn, and the real mystery was only now beginning to unfold. Inspector Davies began his preliminary interviews in Eleanor's private stew. Die, a room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by an enormous mahogany desk. The guests were called one by one, in no particular order that Miss Marple could discern, though she noted with interest that James was summoned first, followed by Catherine, then Dr. Blackwood. Vivian was called just as the grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck 11. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her knitting needles continuing their rhythmic work, though she had long since completed the section she had been working on. Few things were more useful to an investigator than appearing harmlessly occupied while others became increasingly unguarded in their speech. As the hours stretched on, and the drawing room grew stuffy with the accumulated anxiety of too many people in too confined a space, the conversations around her became increasingly unfiltered. "Adrian Harrington," whispered the county councillor to his wife, a thin woman with nervous eyes. "I'd heard he was involved in some scandal or other. Property dealings, wasn't it? Something to do with embezzlement?" "My dear, I have no idea," his wife replied. But Eleanor looked absolutely devastated when the inspector told us. One would have thought they barely knew him. This observation was interesting enough to merit careful consideration. Miss Marple had observed Eleanor's reaction quite closely, and devastated was not the word she would have chosen. Shocked, certainly. Frightened, possibly. But devastated implied an emotional investment that had not been apparent in Eleanor's carefully controlled demeanor. Near the window, two younger women were engaged in whispered speculation. James looked perfectly ghastly when he heard the name, one of them said. "I wonder what that was about." "Probably nothing," her companion replied without conviction. "People react in different ways to death." But Miss Marple's trained ear had caught something in James's reaction that went beyond mere shock at news of a stranger's death. There had been recognition, certainly, but also something else, a kind of grim resignation, as though he had been expecting some form of reckoning, and this was it, finally, arriving. As midnight approached, Eleanor appeared once more in the drawing room, her appearance now suggesting she had made some attempt to restore her composure, though her eyes remained red-rimmed. She announced, with as much authority as she could muster, that rooms had been prepared for those guests who lived some distance away, and who might prefer not to attempt the journey home at such a late hour. The police had agreed that this arrangement would be satisfactory. Most of the guests accepted this offer with barely concealed relief. The idea of remaining in one's own home suddenly seemed far less appealing than it had hours before. There was safety in numbers, and Thornfield Manor, despite its grandeur, had become a place where safety seemed in questionable supply. Miss Marple was among those who accepted Eleanor's offer of accommodation. She was shown to a charming guest bedroom on the second floor, just down the corridor from where she had managed to gather from servants' whispered conversations Adrian Harrington had been discovered. A young maid helped her prepare for bed, her movements jerky and nervous, her eyes betraying the shock that had infected the entire household. Once alone, Miss Marple did not immediately retire. Instead, she sat in the comfortable chair beside the window and considered what she had learned. Adrian Harrington had apparently been involved in some financial impropriety. He had been poisoned with cyanide in Eleanor's library. The fact that he had been present at a garden party seemed significant. It suggested that his arrival, or his presence, had not been entirely unexpected, despite the shock his death had caused. And then there was the matter of that brass key with the peacock head. She had observed James retrieve it from the dining room table when he thought no one was watching, slipping it into his pocket with the quick, furtive movements of a man hiding something. Yet within minutes, the constable had asked him to accompany Inspector Davies for questioning, and James had risen from his chair without protest. The key was no longer visible. As Miss Marple prepared for bed in the unfamiliar room, she found her mind returning repeatedly to the sequence of events. The quarrel she had heard before dinner. Had that involved Adrian Harrington? Had he perhaps arrived at the manor earlier than expected, before the official start of the garden party? And if so, with whom had he been quarreling? She was just settling herself into bed when she heard it, a sound that froze her momentarily under the heavy quilted coverlet. It was the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her room, moving with deliberate quietness toward the far end of the hallway. The footsteps paused near what she estimated to be the library, and there came the soft sound of a door being opened. Miss Marple rose again, moving with surprising agility for a woman of her years, and positioned herself carefully beside the door to her room, which she had left slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, she could see a figure moving along the corridor, tall, slender, unmistakably female. The figure carried a lamp, its light casting long shadows against the corridor walls. It was Vivian. As Miss Marple watched, the younger woman disappeared toward the library, and Miss Marple heard, quite distinctly, the sound of a key turning in a lock. Whatever Vivian was searching for in Adrian Harrington's death, it was something she apparently possessed means to access. Miss Marple returned to her bed, but sleep remained elusive. The investigation had truly begun, and every moment of the night might bring fresh evidence, or fresh destruction of evidence, depending on the desperation of those involved. The morning light that filtered through the guest bedroom curtains held the pale, tentative quality of dawn in early summer. Miss Marple had dozed fitfully through the night, her mind too active to permit genuine rest. She had heard Vivian return to her room sometime around 3 o'clock. The footsteps slower this time, less purposeful. Whatever the younger woman had been searching for, she had apparently found it, or had failed to find it, and accepted that failure with resignation. Breakfast was served in the dining room, though the atmosphere could hardly have been more different from the previous evening's jolly gathering. The long mahogany table seemed to mock them with its elegant emptiness, most of the overnight guests having departed at first light. Only those with genuine connections to the household remained: Eleanor, Catherine, James, and Vivian. Miss Marple accepted a place at the table with quiet grace, declining the offered eggs and bacon in favor of toast and tea. Eleanor looked as though she had not slept at all. Her white hair, which had seemed so carefully arranged the previous evening, now appeared almost deliberately disordered, as though she had been running her fingers through it repeatedly throughout the night. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup, and there was a quality of desperation in her eyes that had not been present even at the height of the previous day's crisis. "Inspector Davies has requested that we all remain available for further questioning," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying none of its usual authority. "He indicated that he would return this morning with additional information from the post-mortem examination." "Did he say anything about what he's found?" James asked, his tone carefully modulated to suggest casual interest rather than urgent concern. But Miss Marple observed the tension in his jaw, the way his fork halted midway to his mouth before he deliberately completed the gesture. "Only that preliminary findings confirm the presence of cyanide," Eleanor replied, "and that there are certain inconsistencies. In the initial assessment of how Adrian came to ingest it, Catherine set down her teacup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "What sort of inconsistencies?" she demanded, her voice higher pitched than usual, betraying her anxiety. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Catherine with an expression that might have been sympathy, or might have been something far more complicated. "I believe that is precisely what the inspector intends to clarify when he arrives." Vivienne, who had been studying her breakfast plate with apparent fascination, looked up briefly. "Adrian must have had enemies," she observed, her tone remarkably detached. "Surely that's what the police will be investigating. His past, his dealings, the people he'd wronged." It was the kind of remark that in normal circumstances might have passed unnoticed, but in the heightened awareness that surrounded murder, it seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. Miss Marple watched closely, as James and Catherine both turned toward Vivienne, their expressions registering surprise at her callousness. "You knew Adrian?" Miss Marple asked quietly, the first words she had spoken since sitting down at the table. Her voice was gentle, the voice of an elderly woman making innocent conversation, but her eyes were sharp and carefully observant. Vivienne met her gaze without flinching. "Not particularly. I'd met him once or twice through James's business connections. I know very little about actually." But the slight tightening around her eyes suggested that this was not entirely true. Miss Marple filed away this discrepancy with the others she had been accumulating since the previous evening. The telephone rang in the entrance hall, and one of the servants answered it. Minutes later, Eleanor was informed that Inspector Davies was on his way and would arrive within the hour. The knowledge seemed to increase the tension at the table rather than relieve it. What had seemed like a straightforward case of poisoning, tragic certainly, but ultimately comprehensible, had apparently become something more complex. After breakfast, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the library, ostensibly to select a book to occupy her time during the waiting period. The room was a magnificent space, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and the kind of atmosphere that suggested generations of accumulated knowledge. The window overlooked the gardens where, just the previous afternoon, guests had circulated beneath the wisteria in civilized contentment. She found the desk where Adrian Harrington's body had apparently been discovered. There was nothing to suggest violence. No overturned furniture, no scattered papers, no signs of struggle. The brass waste bin beneath the desk was empty, recently emptied by the servants, no doubt. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the top of the desk itself, where the dust patterns suggested that something had recently been removed. Something small, rectangular perhaps, the size of a book or a document case. Vivienne's nocturnal visit to the library now took on new significance. The younger woman had been searching for something specific, something that had been near or possibly on this very desk, something that, presumably, Adrian Harrington had either brought with him to Thornfield Manor or had discovered while present here. Miss Marple was still contemplating this puzzle when she heard the sound of an automobile arriving in the gravel drive outside. Inspector Davies had arrived, presumably bearing the additional information that would begin to illuminate the true nature of Adrian Harrington's death and the identity of the person who had orchestrated it. She settled herself in one of the library's comfortable chairs and waited, her knitting once more at hand, the perfect picture of an elderly woman waiting to pass the time. But her mind was already constructing and reconstructing the sequence of events, testing hypotheses against observed behaviors, noting which pieces of the puzzle fit together and which remained stubbornly resistant to arrangement. The answer was there, she was certain of it. She had simply to wait for the facts to align with her observations of human nature. Inspector Davies arrived accompanied by a younger detective constable whom Miss Marple did not recognize, along with Dr. Pettigrew, the county medical examiner. They were shown directly into Eleanor's study, and for the next hour the household fell into a state of suspended tension. Servants moved quietly about their tasks, speaking in hushed tones. Eleanor remained in her study with the inspector. Catherine had retreated to her bedroom. James occupied himself with a newspaper that he appeared not to be reading. Vivienne had disappeared into the garden. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple was summoned for her own interview. Inspector Davies greeted her with the courtesy he extended to all witnesses, but she detected something in his manner that suggested he was aware of her reputation. In villages, gossip travelled with remarkable efficiency, and Miss Marple's involvement in previous mysteries, however peripheral she maintained her role, had not escaped local knowledge. "I trust you slept reasonably well, Miss Marple," Davies began, gesturing toward the chair opposite his own. "Adequately. Thank you, Inspector," she replied, settling herself with careful deliberation, though the circumstances were hardly conducive to restful sleep. "No, quite. I have a few questions, if you don't mind. You arrived at Thornfield Manor yesterday afternoon, I understand?" "Yes, my nephew Raymond drove me. We arrived at approximately 4 o'clock. "And you knew Mr. Adrian Harrington?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, which was technically accurate. "I had no acquaintance with the gentleman." Davies consulted his notes. "Yet you were seated at the dining table quite close to where Mr. James Verton was sitting. Is that correct?" "Yes, I was between Mr. Verton and Colonel Hastings. The seating arrangements were Eleanor's doing. Mrs. Ashford's, I should say. Did you observe anything unusual in Mr. Verton's behavior during dinner? Any particular reactions or interactions?" Miss Marple considered this carefully before responding. The inspector was testing the waters, she realized, trying to determine what she had observed without revealing what he himself had discovered. It was a delicate dance, one that required honesty balanced with appropriate discretion. "I observed that Mr. Verton appeared somewhat preoccupied," she said finally. "He was attentive to his wife, certainly, but his attention seemed divided, as though part of his mind was engaged elsewhere." Davies made a note. "And Mrs. Vivian Verton? What was your impression of her comportment? She seemed entirely at ease, or at least gave every appearance of being so. Though I have often found that those who are most skillful at appearing composed are sometimes those carrying the heaviest burdens." The inspector looked up from his notes, and Miss Marple caught the faintest glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. "You are perceptive, Miss Marple. Tell me, Di. You hear the commotion that preceded dinner, the raised voices?" "Yes, I heard something," Miss Marple admitted, "though I could not discern words or determine the source with certainty. We've established that the quarrel took place in the master bedroom on the second floor. It occurred between 3 and 4 o'clock, approximately an hour before the guests were called to dinner. 2 voices, both apparently male, though one female guest claims to have heard 3 separate voices in rapid succession. This was new information, and Miss Marple's mind immediately began to reorganize itself around this fact. 2 male voices, possibly 3. Adrian Harrington, certainly. James Verton, almost certainly. But a third voice? "Has the household staff been able to identify these individuals?" Miss Marple inquired. Davies hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple understood that he was weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "The staff heard raised voices but could not identify the speakers. However, we have found a piece of evidence that complicates the matter considerably. A document was discovered in Adrian Harrington's jacket pocket. It appears to be a letter of sorts, dated 3 days ago, addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Ashford." He paused, watching for her reaction. Miss Marple maintained her composure, though her mind was working at considerable speed. "The letter contained what might be described as a demand for money," Davies continued. "It referenced certain financial irregularities dating back some 15 years, and suggested that unless a substantial sum was provided by yesterday evening, certain information would be made public that would prove extremely damaging to the Ashford family reputation." "Blackmail," Miss Marple said quietly. "Precisely. Now, what is particularly interesting is that the letter itself was not signed, but the handwriting appears to be that of a woman. We are attempting to match it against writing samples from the household, but the matter is complicated by the fact that the letter may have been written by someone acting on behalf of another party." Miss Marple absorbed this information and began the careful work of reconstructing the sequence of events. Adrian Harrington had arrived at Thornfield Manor, presumably earlier than the official start of the garden party. He had confronted Eleanor, or perhaps others, with knowledge of some financial impropriety dating back 15 years. There had been a quarrel, a demand for money, and an ultimatum. Then, at dinner, Adrian had been poisoned. "Inspector," Miss Marple said slowly, "has there been any determination as to where the cyanide was administered? In what substance, I mean?" Davies studied her carefully. "Your insight is remarkable, Miss Marple. That is precisely what the post-mortem examination has revealed to be problematic. The poison was not in his wine, nor in any of the food he consumed. Dr. Pettigrew's preliminary assessment is that the cyanide was ingested through a substance applied to his lips, possibly a cosmetic preparation of some kind, which would suggest that it was administered by someone during an intimate moment," Miss Marple concluded. "Someone he trusted, someone he would not have suspected of harboring murderous intent." The inspector sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You understand the implications, Miss Marple?" "I fear I do," she replied, and in her mind the pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Miss Marple was released from her interview shortly after noon, and she made her way through the manor with the apparent aimlessness of elderly guests exploring their temporary quarters. In reality, she was conducting a careful survey of the household's layout, noting the position of rooms, the accessibility of corridors, and the various points from which one might observe comings and goings without being observed in return. She found Catherine in the morning room, a light, airy space that overlooked the rose garden. Eleanor's daughter was seated with a cup of tea that she had not touched, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for a moment her expression was entirely unguarded. It was the expression of a woman carrying an unbearable weight. "May I join you?" Miss Marple asked gently, already settling herself into the chair opposite. "Of course," Catherine replied, though she did not seem pleased by the prospect. "Have you finished with the inspector's questions?" "Yes, just now. He is quite thorough, isn't he? Though I imagine the uncertainty must be dreadfully difficult for all of you." Catherine's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. "Difficult hardly encompasses it. My mother is beside herself. My brother-in-law is defensive about matters that have nothing to do with anyone else. And Vivian—" She trailed off, her jaw tightening. "Mrs. Vivian has seemed remarkably composed through all of this," Miss Marple observed carefully. "Yes, hasn't she?" There was something almost accusatory in Catherine's tone. One would almost think she had expected something of this nature to occur. Or perhaps she simply doesn't care. It's difficult to know with Vivian. She has always been rather inscrutable. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully before continuing. "Tell me, did you know Adrian Harrington well?" The change in Catherine's expression was minute but significant. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "Why would you ask that?" "Merely curiosity, my dear. He seems to have been a man of considerable importance to the household, given the circumstances." "I knew him," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago. He was involved in some business dealings with my late father. There was—" She paused, struggling for words. "There was a misunderstanding, a financial matter that was never entirely resolved. And Mr. Harrington has been in contact with the household recently." Catherine nodded miserably. "He arrived 3 days ago. He said he had information that needed to be discussed with my mother. I didn't know what it was about at first, but—" She glanced toward the door as though afraid of being overheard. "He was threatening to expose something from years ago. My father was involved in some improper dealings, and Adrian claimed to have evidence." This aligned with what the inspector had revealed, though Catherine's admission added emotional weight to the bare facts. "And your mother was distressed by this?" "Mother was terrified," Catherine said bluntly. "Father's reputation had been everything to her. The thought that it might be damaged, even posthumously, seemed to devastate her completely." Miss Marple observed the younger woman carefully. Catherine was clearly troubled, but her distress seemed to stem from concern for her mother rather than any direct involvement in Adrian's death. Yet there was something else there, some additional burden that Catherine was struggling to articulate. "You mentioned that you didn't know initially what Adrian wanted," Miss Marple said gently, "but you discovered it subsequently." Catherine's face flushed. I may have overheard a conversation between my mother and Adrian. They were in the study and I was passing in the corridor. I heard Adrian mention a sum of money. He was demanding £50,000. A substantial sum, Miss Marple thought. Sufficient motive, certainly, for someone who desperately wished the threat to disappear. What did your mother decide to do? I don't know, Catherine said, and there was genuine anguish in her voice. I never found out what she decided. And then, at dinner, everything changed. Adrian was dead, and it was as though whatever he was threatening simply ceased to matter. A servant appeared in the doorway to ask if Miss Marple required anything, and Catherine fell silent. But as the elderly woman rose to leave, Catherine caught her wrist. Miss Marple, she said urgently, do you believe my mother that she might have? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that your mother loves you and your brother very much, and that sometimes love compels us to actions we might not otherwise contemplate. She withdrew gently, leaving Catherine staring after her with an expression of mingled hope and despair. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered sufficient information to construct a coherent narrative of events, though there remained certain crucial details that only the killer could provide. She found Inspector Davies in Eleanor's study and requested a private interview. I believe I may be able to assist you in reaching a conclusion, she told him quietly. Though I must warn you that the solution is more complex than a simple matter of blackmail and murder. Davies leaned forward, his expression intent. I'm listening, Miss Marple. The poison, Miss Marple began, was administered through a cosmetic preparation applied to the lips, which suggests intimate contact. Adrian Harrington's final hours involved meetings with multiple members of this household, but only one person had both the knowledge of poisons and the opportunity to administer it in such a manner. She paused, allowing the inspector time to consider the implications. I believe, she continued softly, that you will find the killer was someone whom Adrian trusted completely, someone he would not have suspected of harboring murderous intent, someone, in fact, who had every reason to appear innocent of the crime. Inspector Davies listened to Miss Marple's preliminary observations with increasing attention, occasionally making notes, but largely allowing her to proceed uninterrupted. When she had finished, he sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled before his face in an attitude of deep concentration. Your reasoning is sound, he said finally, but I confess I'm not entirely certain which member of this household you're suggesting committed the crime. The evidence points in multiple directions, and each suspect has both motive and opportunity. That is precisely what makes this case so instructive, Miss Marple replied. The killer has been very careful to ensure that suspicion could plausibly attach to several parties. But there are certain small details, psychological details largely, that reveal the truth to anyone sufficiently observant. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out toward the wisteria-draped terrace where the garden party had taken place less than 24 hours previously. The purple blooms were already beginning to fade, their brief moment of glory passing into inevitable decline. Consider the matter of the letter, Miss Marple continued. The inspector noted that it appeared to have been written by a woman. But what if that assumption was incorrect? What if the handwriting was deliberately disguised to suggest a female author? Davies's eyes sharpened. You're suggesting the letter was written by a man attempting to mimic a woman's hand. I'm suggesting that we should not accept surface observations without questioning them thoroughly. Now consider the timing of events. Adrian arrived at the manor 3 days ago. There was a quarrel in the master bedroom approximately 1 hour before dinner. Yet the letter he carried was dated 3 days prior, before his arrival, which suggests that the blackmail scheme was already in motion before Adrian actually presented himself at Thornfield. The inspector leaned forward. Go on. The poison was administered through a cosmetic preparation, Miss Marple continued. This suggests intimate contact, certainly, but it also suggests something else, knowledge of feminine practices and products. Someone who would not find it unusual to apply such a preparation to another person's lips. Someone to whom such an action would appear entirely natural and unsuspicious. She turned from the window to face Davies directly. I have been observing the household throughout my stay, and I have noticed something quite particular. One member of this family has made a point of appearing devastated by the crime, of demonstrating shock and distress at every opportunity. Yet simultaneously, that same individual has engaged in nocturnal activities designed to conceal or retrieve evidence. Such behavior suggests someone who is simultaneously grieving and guilty. Davies stood and began to pace. You're describing someone with conflicting emotions, someone who both mourned the victim and felt compelled to kill him. Precisely. Someone whose motivations are more complex than simple blackmail and financial threat. At that moment, there came a knock on the study door. One of the constables entered and whispered something to the inspector that caused his expression to shift dramatically. Davies thanked Miss Marple curtly and excused himself, indicating that he required time to pursue certain lines of inquiry that had just become relevant. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room where she found James and Vivian engaged in what appeared to be a civilized but tense conversation regarding the disposition of the evening meal. The household was operating on the assumption that the police investigation would require at least another day, and Eleanor had determined that normalcy, insofar as it could be maintained, should be preserved. Dr. Blackwood entered the room as Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, and he immediately sought out James with an expression of barely concealed urgency. The two men moved to the far corner of the room, and their conversation, though conducted in low tones, carried undertones of significant emotion. "You must tell the inspector," Dr. Blackwood was saying. "If you remain silent, it will only make matters worse for everyone." "I can't," James replied, his voice strained. "You don't understand what's at stake. There are other people involved, people who have done nothing wrong but who would be destroyed if certain information became public." It was at this precise moment that Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her expression distraught. Her eyes searched the room and came to rest on Vivienne, who continued to examine a magazine with studied indifference. "I've told the inspector," Catherine said quietly. "Everything. About Adrian, about father's involvement, about the financial irregularities. I can't carry the burden any longer." Vivian's composure visibly fractured. She rose abruptly, the magazine falling to the floor, her carefully maintained facade crumbling like ancient plaster. For a moment, her face revealed raw emotion, fear, anger, and something that might have been relief. "You fool," she hissed at Catherine. "You've destroyed everything." "Perhaps," Catherine replied, meeting her sister-in-law's gaze steadily. "But at least I've destroyed it honestly." The tension in the room became almost palpable. Dr. Blackwood had moved toward the door, apparently intending to summon the inspector. James stood frozen, his expression suggesting he was witnessing the final collapse of carefully constructed defenses. It was at this moment that Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate precision and rose from her chair. She moved toward Vivian with the apparent fragility of advanced age, yet there was something in her bearing that commanded attention. "My dear," she said gently to the younger woman, "I believe the time has come for honesty, not for the inspector's sake, not for Catherine's sake, but for your own. You have been carrying a terrible burden, and while I understand entirely why you felt compelled to remove Adrian Harrington from the world, I wonder if you have considered what continued deception will cost you." Vivian stared at Miss Marple with an expression of mingled astonishment and desperate hope. "You know," she whispered. "You know what I did." "I have a very good idea," Miss Marple replied. "But the truth must come from you in your own words to the inspector. That is the only way this can be resolved with any degree of dignity." Vivian sank back onto the settee, her hands trembling as though palsied. For a long moment she did not speak, and the only sound in the drawing-room was the ticking of the mantelpiece clock, each second seeming to stretch into an eternity. Finally, she looked up at Miss Marple with eyes that had lost their careful composure entirely. "How did you know?" Vivian asked, her voice barely audible. "Because," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into the chair opposite, "you were the only person in this household for whom Adrian Harrington's death solved an actual problem, rather than merely creating new difficulties. For Eleanor, it eliminated a threat to her late husband's reputation. For James, it removed the prospect of financial exposure. For Catherine, it freed her from the burden of secret knowledge. But for you, my dear, it accomplished something far more profound." Inspector Davies appeared in the doorway, summoned by Dr. Blackwood, his expression alert but not yet fully understanding the significance of the tableau before him. James made a small sound of protest, but Dr. Blackwood placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "Sit down, Inspector," Miss Marple continued, her attention never wavering from Vivian. "I believe Mrs. Vivian Verton has something to tell us. But first, allow me to explain the sequence of events as I have reconstructed them, so that there is no possibility of misunderstanding." Davies settled himself, his notebook at the ready, though he maintained an expression of polite skepticism. Miss Marple had earned respect through her previous assistance, but he was not entirely convinced that her reasoning was sound. "Adrian Harrington arrived at Thornfield Manor 3 days ago," Miss Marple began. "Not as a guest of Eleanor Ashford, as everyone has assumed, but as a guest of someone else. Someone who had summoned him under false pretenses, someone who had something very specific to accomplish." She paused, allowing this assertion to register. The letter found in his pocket was indeed written by a woman, but not Eleanor. The handwriting was deliberately disguised to suggest Eleanor's involvement, thereby ensuring that suspicion would naturally attach to her. "Who wrote it, then?" Davies demanded. "Mrs. Vivian wrote it," Miss Marple replied quietly, "using Adrian's own pen, in fact, which we will find among her possessions. She wrote it knowing that it would draw him to Thornfield Manor. She wrote it as bait, using the threat of exposure regarding Eleanor's late husband's financial improprieties, knowledge she possessed through her marriage to James and her position within the household." Vivian's face had gone deathly pale, but she did not deny the accusation. "Why would she do such a thing?" Catherine asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Because," Miss Marple said, turning her attention to the younger woman, "Adrian Harrington was not merely a man involved in your father's financial schemes. He was someone with whom Mrs. Vivian had a prior connection, a connection of a deeply personal nature. Isn't that correct?" Vivian covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with what might have been tears or might have been laughter. Miss Marple could not quite determine which. "Adrian was my first love," Vivian said finally, her voice muffled. "Before I married James, I was young and foolish, and Adrian was charming and exciting. We were engaged, actually, though the engagement was broken off before anyone in this family knew about it. Adrian left to pursue business opportunities abroad, and when he returned, he came back as a man obsessed with money and power. He had become someone I no longer recognized." She raised her face, and there was anguish written across every feature. "But then, last year, he contacted me. He said he had evidence of financial impropriety involving Eleanor's late husband, and he wanted to know if I would help him leverage that evidence for financial gain. He wanted me to manipulate James and Eleanor into cooperating with his scheme. He said if I didn't help him, he would expose my association with him and ruin my marriage." "So you agreed to his demands?" Miss Marple said gently. "No," Vivian replied. "I told him absolutely not. I said I would have nothing to do with his blackmail. But he was persistent. He came to Thornfield Manor without invitation, threatening to create a scene at the garden party if Eleanor didn't meet his financial demands immediately. He said he would tell everyone about my previous engagement to him, about our relationship. He wanted to destroy me as punishment for refusing to help him." James made a movement as though to comfort his wife, but she held up her hand, preventing him from approaching. "When did you decide to kill him?" Davies asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Not until yesterday," Vivian said. "During the garden party, Adrian came to find me near the wisteria. He was drunk on champagne and confidence, certain that his threats would succeed. He tried to kiss me, to remind me of what we had once been. And at moment, I realized that the only way to escape his grip was to remove him permanently from my life." She took a shuddering breath. "I had cyanide in the house. I keep it in the rose garden for treating plant diseases. I told Adrian that I had reconsidered his proposition, that I wanted to discuss it with him privately before dinner. I suggested we meet in the library, and I applied the cyanide to my lips using a cosmetic preparation. When he tried to kiss me again, believing he had won, he ingested the poison." The room fell absolutely silent. Even Miss Marple, who had suspected this outcome, felt the weight of the confession settle heavily upon her shoulders. "I didn't plan it," Vivian continued, her voice now hollow. But when the opportunity presented itself, I took it. I knew Adrian would die within minutes. I knew that by the time his body was discovered, I would have established a perfect alibi. And I knew that everyone would suspect Eleanor, or James, or Catherine, anyone but the woman he had tried to blackmail into complicity. Inspector Davies rose slowly, his expression grave. Vivian Verton, I must ask you to come with me to provide a full statement regarding the death of Adrian Harrington. You have the right to have a solicitor present during questioning. As the inspector led Vivian from the room, Miss Marple caught a final glimpse of the younger woman's face and saw, to her surprise, an expression not of despair but of profound relief. The departure of Vivian and the inspector left the drawing room in a state of suspended shock. Catherine sank into the nearest chair, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Relief that the killer had been identified, but also a complicated sadness for the woman who had committed the crime. James stood motionless near the fireplace, staring into the unlit hearth as though seeking answers in its empty depths. Dr. Blackwood remained near the door, his professional composure showing signs of strain. Eleanor did not appear until nearly an hour later. She moved into the drawing room with the careful deliberation of a woman who had aged considerably in the space of 24 hours. Her white hair, which she had not bothered to arrange with her usual precision, fell loosely about her shoulders. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of revelations and the collapse of carefully maintained social structures. I have been in my study, Eleanor said without preamble, attempting to comprehend how such events could occur within my own home. I have failed in that endeavor. Catherine rose and moved toward her mother, taking her hand in a gesture of comfort that Eleanor accepted with evident gratitude. James remained by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. The inspector has informed me, Eleanor continued, of the circumstances surrounding Adrian Harrington's death. I confess I am profoundly troubled, not merely by the act itself, but by the fact that my own late husband's indiscretions precipitated such tragedy. Miss Marple, who had remained quietly occupied with her knitting throughout these developments, looked up from her work. Mrs. Ashford, she said gently, your husband's financial improprieties occurred many years ago, and the consequences of those actions cannot be attributed to you. What occurred yesterday was the result of deliberate choices made by an individual driven by circumstances beyond your control. And yet, Eleanor replied, had my husband conducted himself with greater integrity, Adrian Harrington might never have possessed leverage with which to threaten this household. The sins of the father, as they say, visit themselves upon the children. It was a sentiment that carried weight in the room, though Miss Marple was not entirely convinced. Of its validity. Human behavior, in her long experience, was rarely reducible to simple causation. Each individual made choices, and those choices, however influenced by circumstance, remained ultimately their own responsibility. Over the following hours, as the household gradually adjusted to the dramatic turn of events, Miss Marple observed the reactions of those most intimately connected to the crime. Catherine seemed to experience a kind of catharsis, as though the exposure of secrets she had been carrying had lifted an enormous burden from her shoulders. She moved through the manor with renewed purpose, attending to her mother's needs with affection that seemed more genuine than it had before. James, by contrast, retreated into himself. He spent much of the afternoon in his room, emerging only for dinner, which was served in the dining room in an atmosphere of subdued solemnity. He did not speak much. But Miss Marple observed the way his eyes occasionally sought out the spot where Vivian had customarily sat. There was regret there, certainly, but also something more complex, a recognition, perhaps, of the extent to which he had failed to truly know the woman he had married. Dr. Blackwood remained at the manor ostensibly in a professional capacity, though Eleanor had been released from any immediate medical concern. In reality, Miss Marple suspected, he remained because leaving at this moment would constitute an abandonment of Eleanor that he could not bring himself to execute. She observed the two of them together in the evening, seated in Eleanor's private sitting room, speaking in low tones about matters that seemed to involve both comfort and recrimination. It was shortly after 9 o'clock that evening when Inspector Davies returned to the manor. He found Miss Marple in the library, where she had withdrawn with a book that she was not really reading, her mind instead occupied with the intricate patterns of human motivation that the case had revealed. "I thought you might appreciate a brief update," Davies said, settling himself in the chair opposite. "Mrs. Verton has made a full confession. She has engaged a solicitor who is mounting a defense based on temporary insanity brought on by psychological duress. It's a long shot, but not entirely without merit." "What will become of her?" Miss Marple asked. "That depends on the courts," Davies replied. "She committed a calculated murder, which argues against insanity. But her solicitor will argue that Adrian's threats and attempts at manipulation created a psychological state that left her incapable of rational judgment." "The evidence is mixed. And the household?" Miss Marple inquired. "How will they manage the scandal?" Davies leaned back in his chair. "Eleanor Ashford is remarkably resilient. She has already begun to frame the narrative. Vivienne as a disturbed woman with a previous attachment to the victim, her actions the result of emotional instability rather than any failing of the Ashford household itself. It's a strategy that may not succeed entirely, but it will certainly mitigate the damage. And Mr. James Verton? His solicitors are already exploring the possibility of divorce, should he choose to pursue it. Mrs. Verton's crime has effectively destroyed the marriage, though interestingly, he seems more inclined toward compassion than toward abandonment. He has visited her in custody twice already, and appears to be grappling with the question of whether he bears some responsibility for her actions. Miss Marple closed her book thoughtfully. "That suggests a man of conscience, Inspector. Such men are increasingly rare." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained in the library as the evening deepened into night. She thought about Vivienne, sitting in a pole. Icel, finally freed from the burden of Adrian's blackmail, but now facing the inexorable machinery of the criminal justice system. She thought about Eleanor, whose late husband's sins had indirectly precipitated the tragedy. She thought about James, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of the terrible thing she had done. The wisteria outside the library windows had nearly finished its bloom. In another week, the purple flowers would be entirely gone, replaced by green foliage that would carry no memory of the beauty that had preceded it. Life would continue at Thornfield Manor, though marked forever by the knowledge of what had transpired beneath its roof. Miss Marple rose slowly and made her way toward her guest bedroom, her mind finally settling into the restful state that would permit sleep. Tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, she would return to St. Mary Mead. But for tonight, she would remain in this house where murder had been committed and justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. The morning of Miss Marple's departure arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that characterizes early summer mornings in the English countryside. Sunlight streamed through the guest bedroom windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny stars through the still air. She had packed her modest belongings with the methodical precision that characterized all her movements, and by 10 o'clock she was prepared to leave Thornfield Manor. Eleanor came to see her off, accompanied by Catherine. The former's face bore the marks of sleepless nights and profound emotional exhaustion. Yet there was also something approaching composure in her bearing, the resilience of a woman who had weathered considerable storms in her life and would weather this one as well. "I cannot thank you adequately, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, taking the elderly woman's hand. "Your perception of events proved invaluable to the inspector's investigation. More importantly, your gentle insistence that truth must be faced has permitted this household to begin the process of healing." "I merely observed what others overlooked," Miss Marple replied with characteristic modesty. "Human nature, Mrs. Ashford, tends to reveal itself through small gestures and unguarded moments. One has only to pay attention." Catherine embraced Miss Marple warmly, and there was genuine affection in the gesture. "I shall never forget what you've done for our family," she said. "You gave us the opportunity to move forward with honesty rather than continuing to live beneath the weight of secrets, As Raymond's motor car wound down the Manor Drive, Miss Marple turned in her seat to observe Thornfield Manor receding into the distance. The wisteria had lost most of its bloom, and the purple flowers that remained were browning slightly at the edges. The house itself seemed to settle back into its accustomed state of comfortable grandeur, its brief notoriety already fading into the background of village gossip that would eventually focus on newer, fresher scandals. The drive back to St. Mary Mead took approximately 2 hours, and during that time Miss Marple's mind occupied itself with the larger patterns that the case had illuminated. She thought about Adrian Harrington, a man whose capacity for charm had been gradually eroded by an obsession with material gain. She thought about Vivian, whose youthful innocence had been corrupted by Adrian's attempts at manipulation, and whose solution to her predicament had been as violent as it was inevitable given her psychological state. Most of all, she thought about the fragility of the social structures that governed village life and country house society. These structures depended entirely upon the willingness of individuals to attain fictions, to pretend that everyone was approximately as they appeared, that motivations were generally benign, that the social order reflected some kind of natural and just arrangement of human relationships. Murder, when it occurred within these carefully maintained structures, revealed the extent to which those structures were sustained by collective agreement rather than by any inherent stability. Remove one individual from the equation, and suddenly the careful architecture of social pretense became visible in all its essential fragility. St. Mary Mead seemed almost absurdly peaceful after the drama of Thornfield Manor. The village green, the church, the high street with its modest shops, all appeared exactly as they had when Miss Marple had departed for the garden party 4 days previously. Yet she perceived subtle changes in the village itself. Gossip had arrived before her, carried by guests who had fled the manor, and by servants whose networks of communication extended throughout the county. She encountered several villagers during her walk from the motor car to her cottage, and each greeting carried undertones of curiosity barely concealed beneath courtesy. By evening, she was certain, the entire village would possess a detailed and largely inaccurate account of the events at Thornfield Manor. In her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her familiar armchair with a cup of tea and allowed herself to reflect more comprehensively on the case. She thought about the small details that had guided her toward the truth: Vivian's nocturnal visit to the library, the dust patterns on the desk suggesting a recently removed object, the peculiar relief in Vivian's expression upon confession. But more importantly, she thought about the human elements that had made the murder not merely possible, but almost inevitable. She thought about the psychology of blackmail, how it created a state of desperation that rendered previously unthinkable actions thinkable. She thought about the destructive power of obsession, how Adrian's fixation on wealth and revenge had ultimately destroyed him as thoroughly as it had destroyed Vivian's peace of mind. Most profoundly, she reflected on the question of culpability and justice. The law would judge Vivian Verton, would weigh her actions against whatever criteria the courts deemed appropriate. But Miss Marple understood that justice, in any meaningful sense, had already been served in a far more subtle manner. Vivian had freed herself from Adrian's grip, but only by enslaving herself to the consequences of murder. Eleanor had preserved her late husband's reputation, but at the cost of confronting the truth of his moral failures. Catherine had unburdened herself of secrets, but had gained in exchange a more complex understanding of her family's history. As the evening deepened and the familiar sounds of the village at rest replaced the daytime sounds of commerce and activity, Miss Marple set aside her teacup and returned to her knitting. The pattern before her was intricate but logical, each stitch contributing to a larger design that would only become fully apparent once the work was complete. She thought of human nature as rather like this knitting, a complex interweaving of motivations, experiences, and choices, each strand contributing to a pattern that was both unique and somehow inevitable. Understanding that pattern required patience, careful attention, and the willingness to perceive connections that others overlooked. The mystery of Adrian Harrington's death had been solved, the killer had been identified, and justice, however imperfectly, had been served. But Miss Marple knew that in a larger sense, the true patterns of causation and consequence would continue to unfold throughout the lives of those involved for years to come. She picked up her knitting needles once more and continued with her work, her ancient hands moving with the steady rhythm of long practice, creating order and beauty from simple wool and deliberate action, much as she had attempted, in her own modest way, to create understanding from the chaos of human passion and crime.